So I had Italians coming to me
Yeah.
because I was a member of the Italian club, and they said, "Hey, you know what?" Well, I went to the meetings and celebrations, and they said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Look, Italians are very generous people."
He didn't say, forget about it.
Welcome to Books in Hindsight, the only podcast where hindsight is always 2020. And we explore the great books, works, and ideas of the century. Now, here's your host, teacher, and author, Matthew Heines.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special Books in Hindsight. I have with me Mr. Nick Licata, former Seattle City Councilman, to talk about his new book, which we have right here. It's called Student Power, Democracy, and Revolution in the 60s. It's a fantastic book. I've had a chance to read through it, and I found that, and I just hope that you can see the book as I start talking. I found the book to be not only a fantastic historic narrative, but it also gives an insight into student government, into the movement that occurred in the 1960s, what really brought it about, and the cultural changes that occurred because of people like Mr. Nick Licata. So, Nick Licata, first of all, I want to thank you for all of your service on the Seattle City Council, as well as your service in Seattle politics.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Nick is a very modest man, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Nick's book in a second, but what we want to talk about right now, and one thing that we cannot really stress enough, is Nick's contribution to Seattle politics. Nick is a historic institution, and his head is so full of knowledge, and we're going to be able to access some of that knowledge, some of the things that happened in the 60s, and some of the things that worked, and some of the things that maybe didn't work so well. So, Nick Licata, let's start the interview.
Okay.
First thing, tell us about Nick Licata. You started in the Midwest. You didn't start out in Seattle. So what we want to find out is what led you from the Midwest, a conservative bastion, to a place like Seattle, Washington.
Right. Well, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. My dad was a barber when he got some employment. He generally had 2 or 3 jobs. My mom worked in a Hallmark factory, believe it or not, making greeting cards until she got sick. She was unfortunately sick most of her life. And neither of them had graduated from high school. So, and I had, as a youth, dyslexia. So I actually could not read until the 4th grade. And I never thought I was going to graduate from high school, let alone get to college. But I had one brother. We working class family. In Cleveland was very segregated. So 2 blocks over there was a black neighborhood. We never saw a black kid in our neighborhood, and we never went to the neighborhood. Mostly out of fear on both sides. You know, we were afraid we'd be beaten up, which we're occasionally were, but that was by other white kids. So, and I got through high school. Thanks to the way those days government worked, there was actually money available for, I would say, low to middle class. We always consider ourselves middle class, but in fact, these days, economically be considered very, very low working class. And but college was affordable. My parents could only afford 1 year of college, which came out to about $1,000. Of course, this is in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And after that, though, I could put myself through college with some federal loans, a grant, and the grants at that time were based on just being low income. You didn't have to be dirt poor, and you didn't have to meet any other kind of criteria. I was an average student, quite honestly. And then working every summer, everything from squeegeeing walls to McDonald's. But I was able to get through college without, unfortunately now, graduating with a huge amount of debt. So times were different then, and that, if anything, was an era when government really supported higher education in a way that wasn't so unusual.
Yeah.
So I came to Seattle because I had an opportunity to go to graduate school in sociology, and took it up. I went, and I didn't like Seattle initially because I was used to the East Coast, and I said, "Where are all the buildings?" I wouldn't say that now, and but I went to UW. I was there for about 3 or 4 years, and met some really good people and other students. And we actually, just as my girlfriend at that time became my wife, we took off hitchhiking for Europe for a year, and survived on $5 a day, which was a book at that time. But the group of people I was with bought a house that was at that time an old convent on Capitol Hill. There was 2 professors, and they chipped in money. The whole house was 10,000 square feet, and they only had $5,000 between them, so they bought it. It sold for $40,000. It's now worth over $2 million because it's a classic, what they call classical sort of architecture, and it's a collective. It's always been a collective. For now, it's going on 50 years. And I grew up there. I grew up there, but I was there for 25 years, and raised my daughter there with my wife, and it's still going, which is great.
Okay, so you're in Seattle, and at some point in time, you're going to get involved in Seattle politics. But before you got into Seattle politics, you had I guess we're going to say from the book, you had a life-changing occurrence out in Bowling Green at your university, where you saw that the students could actually have an input into how, well, I guess what you're talking about is the grade system, the semester system.
Right.
That was your first insight,
Yeah.
and that's what really led you all the way to Seattle, to the city council, to all this stuff. So I don't want to at all give away the book, but this is such an interesting story of how of a catalyst that started so small,
Right.
that led into the person that you became. So let's just go into the book then. Let's talk about your experience. And in the book, you talk about a couple of things that really sparked my interest. The first one was SDS.
Yes.
And it's really important that people understand. I mean, I'm not going to have you give us a history lesson,
Right.
but you grew up Roman Catholic,
Yes.
very conservative, and people don't understand today that there's no alternative. I mean, there's no alternative belief system. There's no alternative networks or, chats or social media, whatever. What you get is what you get, correct? And you're basically
In those ages, yes.
Yeah.
In that period of time.
So what you're talking about when you talk about, can you just give us a little background and tell us what the Port Huron Statement was?
Sure. Port Huron Statement was written around 1972. It was a statement that talked about a concept that at that time when I was in college, I was very excited to come into. It was participatory democracy. Mm-hmm. And my mindset at that time, if I just talk a little bit, when I got to college, like I said, I was so honored to be in college. I could not believe it. And statistically, it was a period of time that was unique in United States history. Colleges were flooded by essentially working class kids, because up until then, there were very elite colleges. Community colleges did not exist. And the public schools were largely teaching schools, largely male, very few female, and actually almost for the large public schools in states like Ohio, largely white. And when I graduated, I was there for 4 years in '69, there was only 1% of the population was black, of the students. And that was a public school. This wasn't an elitist school. In any case, when I got to college, knowing that my dad, my family were not, we'd say wealthy, but we're just struggling all the time. And I saw college as a place that I had an open opportunity. I could possibly do something. My dad always emphasized, get education, you can get ahead. For me, to get education, it opened my eyes, figure out what was around. And some of us were not into sororities or fraternities. They literally dominated our college and most other public colleges. They were very elitist, although we're talking about not super wealthy, but you had to be selected to join them. You had to conform to what they wanted. And they were the student leaders throughout the government. They were the pretty people, the people who were always chosen to lead everything. And I was a very strong feeling that we should all be more equal. I mean, I'm somewhat resentful, I couldn't afford to be in a fraternity if I wanted to be. And I came across this, it was literally a pamphlet, and it was called the Port Huron Statement. It was written by people roughly my age, and they belonged to a group that I'd never heard of, Students for a Democratic Society, sound like a good name. And the book was very short, I can't remember, it was probably 120 pages maybe. And it basically said, we have the power to create our own future. And it does mention the Vietnam War, which is beginning to boil up at that time and expand, saying, we should ask, why are we in a foreign country? Why are we fighting there? What is our interest? I didn't say national interest, but what's the interest of citizens? And I found that just so liberating, so eye-opening. And so did other students at the college, not a whole lot of them, and the core of us. And we grabbed onto that, and that's when we decided to form, hey, let's start a chapter of Students for Democratic Society. We didn't know what it was. It was a very open organization. That was the strength, actually. You didn't have to sign off on a set of beliefs. You basically had to say, we believe in a democracy, and we think everybody should participate in it. It was very sort of a low denominator. And as soon as we began it, we started all of a sudden being considered communists because we were criticizing or questioning at that time the Vietnam War. In fact, we passed out literature from the Quakers, American Friends Society. And the one table we set up would just have these pamphlets saying, is this war a good idea? This is what's going on there. And the table got turned over by some other jock students. And this whole student body, which is 10,000, some people are suggesting we should have a vote whether you should even form a chapter, whether you can even have a chapter on the campus. We eventually had some professors who believed, no, we want students to question what's going on. We do believe that this is fine. And the student council, which was the governing body for the students, finally decided that, yes, as long as we had a faculty member who would sign off and be responsible in case we went crazy, you could be a recognized student organization, so we succeeded in doing that. But that was my sort of first step, that thinking differently could cause you to be labeled as a, not just an outsider, but a potential dangerous person. And people that didn't want to be around you because they were afraid that they would be considered to be not part of the in crowd, but they would be discriminated against.
Yeah. So there's so many elements that you touch on. In the book at this point in time, you've got Herbert Hoover saying SDS is a communist. It's a communist.
Associated with communists.
Yeah.
And so he always threw that out there, yes. And there was in Congress, in the House, there was a committee called the House on Un-American Activities, HUAC. And many years later, I found out that I was actually on a list that they had of SDS leaders. It was published. And I was like, what? Because I was not a big name. I was a small college, medium-sized college. We never did anything approximating violence. we did a protest. But that's how heavy the sense of control was over possible dissent. I wouldn't even say dissent, possible dissent. And I should say it was many, many times worse for black students. But we don't generally in our literature now talk about how white students were questioning what was going on. We did the same thing, much more milder form, but it also helped us think about, and I think identify with other people who were going through much worse times. Because if we're going through this, can you imagine what they're going through?
When you were able to get involved in school politics,
Yes.
that you said, I can't remember what it was, but culturally, that must have been completely shocking. I mean, you have a whole generation that fought World War II, came home, raised their kids, you're going to do it just like, by the book, and then suddenly you guys see there's another way to do things. What was your idea of democracy? I mean, when the SDS came out with their, Students for Democracy and their paper, what was your idea of democracy before that?
It was something you learn out of the textbook. It was like being a very cold breakfast. You weren't particularly interested in reading it. I mean, eating it, but you knew it was healthy for you, right? And then democracy was pretty much like that. You sort of felt, wow, yeah, democracy is a good thing. I'm glad we have democracy. The big boogeyman was communist Soviet Union, and we don't want to be like them, so we're glad where we are. But it didn't have any dynamism to it. It didn't have any, we said the Pledge of Allegiance and we believed in freedom, but there was nothing attached to it as far as what was there in our world. And the thing that I eventually, as I became more involved in on-campus politics, and I only ran for student council as a junior. Up until then, I was active in other kinds of things. But the kind of activity on campus that drew an enormous amount of attention for a very little thing is one of the people I talk about in my book, Ashley Brown, who went on to teach at Harvard. He noticed there was a UN Day, and it was a flag. All the foreign countries had flags, or a group of them, and one was the Union of South Africa, which at that time had apartheid, which is separation enforced by law between blacks and whites. And he put up a sign saying this flag should be taken down. That's all. He didn't pull it down, he didn't burn it, just put a sign up. Immediately, front page newspaper, the president came out and said he was embarrassed by this sign. So it's hard to imagine now a culture that was so ossified in a belief system that did not actually have any exercise in exercising of those beliefs. They were on paper. Democracy, expression of belief. But when you did it, it was considered an affront. It was considered abnormal. It was considered something that was almost treacherous.
Well, Nick, you and I share a common background growing up in, I guess I'll say it loosely, poverty. And does that give you kind of an outlook on, well, democracy works for those rich kids over there, but democracy, that has nothing to do with me. I got to get a job. I got to make a living. So let the rich people deal with democracy. Is that the world that we're talking about?
Well, yes, but I would say it wasn't like democracy works for them. It's like, as intellectuals, I think we tend to think of categories. And we tend to think of, rich and poor, and democracy works for them, but not for us. But I think growing up, and maybe now for a lot of folks, it's not like democracy works for them and not for us. It's like democracy just doesn't exist in any really dynamic sense. We all believe in democracy. I mean, it's like watching people on January 6th who were invading Congress. Those people thought they were exercising democracy. They thought they were exercising freedom. They were engaged in quite honestly, very sort of, talk about rioting. They were rioting in the worst sense. They were trying to destroy our government, which, for all its faults, still had a democratic function. The democratic function was you get to choose your leader, and then you move on. And they didn't like the leader that was chosen, so they didn't want to move on. So growing up in a neighborhood that was, I don't want to say it was poverty. I don't think people saw themselves as poor, but we were struggling to get by. Every single dollar we had to look at. We only went on one family vacation, literally out of the state, for my whole 20 years growing. That was a big deal. My parents never got on an airplane. So there was a certain sort of sense. You never thought of yourself as being poor. You thought yourself as middle class. In fact, you do a survey now, most people who would probably fall below the poverty line probably think of themselves as middle class. It's a sense that it's a marketing sense that we're all one thing, right? We're all in one class. But what I learned was, and I saw, was that certain people had access to resources, and I realized that was largely money. It was also class in the sense of they had a better opinion of themselves. They felt like they were entitled to a better life. For us, it was like, it'd be nice to have a better life. I don't know if we can get one. And one of the things that I think was really critical to the movements of the 60s, and now still critical to any movement that's trying to push, we'll say, a progressive agenda or an agenda that makes citizens in a democracy a real thing, is a culture that questions who has power and what they're doing with it and who's benefiting from it. And that was and is, I think, an important shift that needs to happen in any culture at any time, that needs to continually. It's almost like what Thomas Jefferson said, and I may have gotten this quote wrong, you need a revolution every 20 years or something of that sort. I don't think people sometimes either ignore it or they think, oh yeah, that's going to happen. But in a way, it's a revolution of thought. It's a revolution of saying, wait a second, this isn't right. I mean, same thing happened when the first black students sat down in the restaurant, and decided they weren't going to move away from the counter. They were going to stay there. And that resulted in black protests throughout the whole South, but no one had done that. Or Rosa Luxemburg, not going to sit in the back seat of the bus. And at college, like you mentioned, is small, and this is it, like forest fires start by a single match, okay? They can't, that often. And revolutions in thought, sometimes in action, often start by the most minor thing possible. And it's someone saying, no, that's not right. We want to change it. And my situation, very minor, was that we were moving from semester systems to quarter systems. I read it in the newspaper. I was with my friend at that time, a guy named Ivan. And I said, oh. And he goes, wait a second, they didn't ask us. We're students. They're changing our lives around. And I was like, oh yeah, why didn't they ask us? And we started a petition. The campus had never had a petition before. This wasn't a petition to do anything that, quite honestly, was probably really more relevant. But, it's like, hey, should they ask us? And I'd say 2/3 of the students wouldn't sign it. We were afraid they might be thrown out of campus because they signed a petition saying we should be asked. Or they ignored it and said basically nothing ever gets done, which is in some ways was always the biggest hurdle. Cynicism. Cynicism in some ways is worse than conservatism, because cynicism gets at your soul. It basically drains your soul of any energy of saying that you can do something. It's in some ways, I think, harder to get a cynic to challenge the system than it is to get a conservative. Because the conservative is trying to defend the system. And what you have to convince them is the system's not working for that person. A cynic doesn't believe that the system can do anything. And there's not any reason to have any opposition to it. But in any case, that exercise, And again, the newspaper was so maybe hard up for material. We got on the front page of the paper. Couldn't believe it. It's like, what? This is what it takes, rather than having football or basketball. And that got the ball rolling for me. And then I started looking around and asking other things. And then eventually it got the blacks on campus to eventually say, go to the student council at that time and say, there were no blacks in the student council. There was one black the prior year. And I went back to college many years later. And by that time, there was a black student body president, and there were blacks on campus, and there was, I don't know what the percentage was. It was well over 10%. But like I said, when I went there, it was only 1%. And the one black student who was active in black fraternities, and by the way, the fraternities were all segregated, said, look around. You know how many blacks on campus are athletes because they got a certificate, they got a scholarship. And that statement alone, to a very conservative student body, allowed some of those students who were conservative by nature, by culture, looked around and said, you're right. That's we need to rethink what's going. We need to change it. We got a conservative student council. There were like close to 50 of them on there, and the vast majority were conservative, agreed at that meeting to say, yes, we will put black student representatives on the council, just because we've been discriminated against them for so long. The following next month was challenged on legal grounds, and we couldn't do it, but we decided that, yes, we're going to change our entire system way of operating council, because at that time, fraternities had a seat on the council, even though all fraternities were white. So we were already breaking this rule. So the irony is that the conservatives who said, no, we don't want blacks to break the rules, said, okay, we'll follow the rules, and we knocked off all of the entitled white organizations that are on the council as well. So I also learned that you can use laws to your advantage. You have to know what's there, you have to learn how to use them, and that's why I got involved with student council government, and that's why I got involved in politics in Seattle. I decided that I wanted to change the laws to make it, and that's what it's about. If you live in a democracy, the laws should be written by the people, and you want to get the right people there to make the right laws.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Hope you are enjoying this great podcast. We just want to remind you, if you want to see more great books by more great authors, just go to booksinhindsight.com. We have books, we have apparel, and all kinds of great merchandise just waiting for you. So come to booksinhindsight.com. Now, back to our great interview with Mr. Nick Licata. So you've gone in and you've changed the laws, and at least as far as your college goes, and you're starting to see that things around in, I guess we'll call it Brady Bunch America, which is I actually wrote a paper on this when I was in college, that it wasn't really, it served some people, but it wasn't serving everybody. So really quickly, I just want to ask you, what does your faith, how did your faith apply to when you saw what you were raised in Christianity, but when you looked around and you see people not treated the same way, did any of your Catholic faith have anything to do with your political beliefs?
Well, yes. And, it's interesting too. Roman Catholic, growing up, and by the way, all through college, there's catechism. I don't know if you're familiar with Roman Catholics, they have catechism. I went to catechism classes through college. I was involved in SDS. I was considered at that time one of the primary radicals on campus, and I was still going to church. I went to church all the way through college because I was a believer, and still am to a certain extent, that and I probably put it in a different frame now, more in a spiritual sense, but in that sense, it was more real, attached to the Roman Catholic Church, and of course Jesus Christ, who's is a great icon for for thinking about reaching out to people like the lepers, right? The women who were accused of being whores, but just because why? They weren't under the control of their husband or something of that sort. Going out and recognizing that they had as much right as the next person to enjoy life.
Mm-hmm.
And Catholicism didn't put it in that exact frame, but it opened the door to that frame. And Jesus Christ, as the historical character and the religious character, also opened up that door. So, there was in America, I think it was the early 1900s, a thing called the social gospel movement. I wasn't part of that, but I can see where it came from. And also began to question some things in that faith as well. Like, why weren't they doing enough in the areas of, for instance, racial relations? Like, why is it that we don't see many black Catholics? All of a sudden that occurred to me. But also, other things seem limiting. So you start to question, where does this authority come from? Because the church is an authority figure as well. And you realize that, like any authority figure that's run by human beings, there are going to be faults. Mm-hmm. No one is perfect.
Yeah, I just think that, and I didn't know the answer to the question, but I think there is a certain element of nonconformism in Christianity, in the original Christianity. Mm. Now, since they took it over for the government's purposes, then that's all gone. But I think, you see the Catholic Church in Central and South America always, going for the cause of the poor people. So, mm-hmm. I think that, I think the Catholic Church does, and Christianity in general, in some cases, leaves the door open for nonconformism and for you to speak up when something's not right. Unfortunately, there's not enough people who think that Christianity is kind of a form of rebellion. So,
well, here's just add on to that. You have to keep in mind that the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, have always had a very significant portion of Christians and Catholics and church groups that have been in the forefront of mm-hmm. organizing citizens to question the authority of the government as far as, is this in the interest of everyone? Mm-hmm. So they not the entire church, not all of Christianity, but Christianity has enough, I would say, variance in it that it allows for a portion of them to become mm-hmm. very active in what we call these days progressive movements.
Yeah, provided you don't offend the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Yes.
So, okay, well, that's great. So, Nick, let's go, let's get into the motivation. People are going to say, hey, it's 2020?
Yeah.
And what's a book from the 60s? What's that gonna do for me?
Right, right.
So what is, I mean, I know the answer to that.
Sure.
But why don't you answer that? What's that going to do for somebody?
Well, it's funny. Whenever I meet an author, and I do book reviews, so I meet them and interview them, I often ask them, so who's your audience? Who do you expect is going to read your book? What's the purpose there? And here, I would say that it's multifold, but certainly what's referred to these days, hopefully not in a pejorative sense, as boomers, people who went through the 60s, and the people who've read it, who fall into that category, say, I forgot so much about why I did certain things. I really reflect on it now more. And they're still alive, they're still voting, and they're still active, and it rekindles their sense of, yes, I still can think outside the box. I can still contribute something to other people. So it does, say, reignite the creative questioning of people who are older. Okay. The other group that I'm trying to reach are people who are millennials, people who are young students right now, who, like perhaps we did then, think I'm the first one here. I'm the first one that to recognize there's things wrong. And I think it's important to know that other people have done that, and they have certain things that they found. One is that it's not just not economics. It's not just laws. It's culture. That's one of the things I emphasize in the book. There was a real cultural revolution going on that allowed the anti-war movement, the civil rights, and everything. It was a culture of wanting to share as a community. A culture of community, a culture that was not based on individualism. It's sort of interesting. There are some very conservative authors now, columnists that are pushing this idea. And blanking out his name, Dave, in any case, basically said, one of the biggest problems I had is a conservatism, thinking that it was about individualism. It's really about community. And that's the thing that I think I would hope that if people read this book to come away with, is recognizing that from community and growing community, you can create a positive movement. But also, you have to look at what tools are around you that you can use, is trying to think that you have to discard all them and start anew. And that was one of the other things that I discovered, and I think people in reading this book will recognize that, and I did this when I was on the city council too. I recognized that there were rules in the books that people ignored. They never really enforced them. Positive rules. Perfect example. While I was on the city council, I was one of the authors for paid sick leave. In fact, I was the primary sponsor. And then also for raising the minimum wage to $15. So I was one of the main sponsors there. And after we passed those laws, which were unique in the whole nation, other cities started to adopt them after us, I realized that there will always be opposition to what you're doing, even when you win. If you pass good legislation, there will still be opposition. Even after the Civil War, after the Reconstruction and people, gave blacks the vote, there was a tidal wave of conservatives that took away and stripped away those rights. And the same thing happens in our era and will happen in the future. It doesn't ever stop. There's not going to be a final utopia that you reach. That is probably one of the reasons that you have cynicism. People work really hard on something, they won, and then they see things altered, and they say, oh, I guess we lost. No. It's like the voyage is the adventure. You're not going to reach paradise or this utopia island. You go through it, there'll be a period when you have it, but there's always going to be infestation. There are always going to be bugs. There's always going to be insects. You're not going to get rid of them, right? So regarding those laws that we passed in the city, most recent example just made my blood boil. I was at a restaurant, and they added 4% with a service charge. And I asked the waiter, I said, well, the waitress actually, I said, does this go to you? Oh no, we don't get any money on it. It all goes to the restaurant. And I said, and she said, I'm not sure I can explain it. I said, oh, I know what that means. We increased your minimum wage, and they're trying to get their money back. So they're basically adding an extra charge to the restaurant, the meal that we paid for, and you're not getting any of that. She goes, that's right, that's what's happening. And the same thing happened with paid sick leave. People were not getting the paid sick leave that we guaranteed, because some of the companies were trying to find ways around it. So it's not just in a political sense. I would say when you vote someone to office, that's not enough. You have to continually work with them and also keep an eye on them and make sure they follow through. And I have known a number of people, good people, progressive people, you want to call them, whatever, who get into office and try really hard. But one of the problems they make is they stop thinking that they have to still work with others. What I say, continue to be an organizer. They have to continually push the envelope. You can't stop pushing the envelope.
All right, well, let me just jump into here because when you were on the city council, because what you're talking about is people that get into office suddenly become a money collecting machine. And what you just said basically goes out the window because everything comes to getting reelected. I mean, that's the whole thing. How did you avoid that?
Well, it didn't entirely, because we're all human. We have a job that we like to keep it. That's human nature, right? If a politician gets into office, they like the game of politics, trying to convince people to do it your way, right? They like the idea of, hey, people recognize my name, or hey, look, I'm in the newspaper. We all like being stroked, right? And also they realize politicians literally have to come before their boss, which is the public, every 4 years, 2 years, and have to get approval, right? And so they keep telling people, hey, this is what I did. This is what I did, I think the major mistake that many politicians make is that they never explain to folks why they did something. And the biggest people that have explained to are the people who got them into office, because they may not agree with them. In fact, some of the strongest disagreements I had were people who got me into office. But I realized I'm just going to be honest with them. I'll tell them, this is what I did. So, I started a newsletter, and I continue it now over 25 years. I've changed the name now. It's Citizenship Politics. It's a column or a newsletter I put out twice a month. But anyhow, when I was on the city council, I was writing it, and I didn't write about, hey, I passed this for you, or hey, this is really important. This is what I did. I said, look, this is what I'm thinking about. This is where I'm going, and I think it's good for this reason. And I was surprised how many people came back and said, and I had, strangely enough, a number of libertarians or conservatives who supported me, because I don't agree with most of the stuff you do, but I really admire that you tell me what you're doing, and I'm going to still support you. And I still have people like that. That is a mistake. And also on money, the one thing I really disliked were people who had easy races and raise as much money as possible. Now I understand in Congress they do that because they give money to other Democrats, maybe, or other Republicans. But the problem is they're not attaching it to not just another person in their party, they're not attaching it to an issue for what that person should be running for. So when I was running, and on the city council, it's nonpartisan, when I was running was citywide. So for instance, after we passed paid sick leave, and I knew that I had a very weak opponent and I was probably going to win re-election, my first response was, I'm just not going to raise that much money. And I knew someone who was running without any opposition and was raising over $100,000. And why are you raising so much money? Well, I can't. I'm thinking, that's stupid. I don't want to take someone's money for that. But the money I did raise, I made calling cards to hand out at restaurants that I went to. So on one side, the legally I had to make it connected to the campaign. So it's Licata running for re-election. The backside, I said, know the law. You are entitled to paid sick leave. And then I said, this is a phone number. If you're not getting paid sick leave, call this number. I did the same thing for minimum wage. So of course I gave out a card. So this way it was an educational piece. People should use their campaign literature to educate the public what power they have, the rights they have.
Yeah. Boy, you bring up a lot of different issues, but let's talk about money. All right. So how often was money in the races that you competed in, how often did they really spend a lot of money to get you out?
Well, certainly the first race I ran, I was outspent more than 2-1, you know. And it's sort of funny. I would say there's only one. I ran 5 times and won. And that so the first time and the second to the last time, I was outspent 2 or 3-1 because people were. There was a young woman who, nice woman, but she wasn't sure whether she was running as a conservative or a liberal. So she was. One of her platforms is let's hire 300 more police. You know, which was like what? You know, so it was. You know, I knew she was too confused all over the whole place. But businesses, a lot of folks with big, deep pockets gave her a lot of money, so I knew that I had a real race in my hand. And also, I was older and she was younger, so you know there was that age gap. That happens, you know. And people, I was running for my 4th term, so I can understand people. Well, try something else, see what's going to happen. But the other races. It's a very funny thing that happened. I never raised a lot of money. In fact, of all the incumbents, I always raised the least amount of money. Probably because I didn't go to people with deep pockets. Secondly, it wasn't I wasn't lazy, but I asked a lot of people to give me money, but I said, top it off at this amount, you know, $100, which is a lot for most people, because I know it's a lot for me. Most people say even $25, you could do that. Because I figured if they even gave me a little bit of money, if I had a really serious race, then they'd probably give more. But I had the police guild for at least 3 races out there campaigning to try to get someone to run against me. They did it one time, and I beat that person easily. And the business community. So the business community and the police were always out looking for someone to run against me. And because I had, this is the other thing, I was in the papers a lot because I was usually on the 8-1 or 7-2 vote on the losing end. But that's because the issues that we're fighting for were popular issues. And the council just was, I think, tone deaf. And so in a way, I was winning recognition for standing up to the council. And the council eventually did change. Eventually, now, if I was on the council now, I would not be a standout. I'd be one of the people who would, you know, be in favor of helping the homeless and be in favor of making sure that we don't have tenant restrictions. I was one of the first, I was the first person on the council, one of the first people on the council to come out saying, we have to control rent so they're not being gouged. I got legislation, the only legislation passed up until that time, that actually said landlords had to give a certain amount of time of notice to their tenants if they increased their rent by a certain amount that year. And no one did it before because the law says you can't do rent control. They'll define this as rent control. I said, let's pass it and see. They didn't challenge it because it was considered reasonable. Now, of course, it went on to do other things. But in any case, you just have to push the envelope. You have to basically use what authority you have. And, you know, sometimes you have to see what happens. But that's, you know, that's the way to go.
Can you survive in politics if you went back into it?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, quite honestly, I told myself every time.
Would you try? I mean,
would I try?
Yeah.
Yes.
Or is that just too crazy?
No. Well,
considering what's going on right now.
Well, first of all, I want to say that
you have the police are threatening. A quarter of the police are threatening to quit today.
No, I understand. Two issues. Or let me make a couple points. One is, for someone in office has to have the mindset. I did. I don't know if they have to. I'm not gonna be in office next year. I mean, I'm not gonna win the election. So my life goes on. I'm not gonna be destroyed. I'll just go on. Once you have that mindset, it changes everything. It's like, okay, I'm free. I can do what I want because I'm not gonna be here next time. This is my last term. You're still running for office. But you're running to convince people what should happen.
Yeah.
There's a difference doing that than convincing them to vote for you, right? So that's the first thing. And so, yeah, I don't mind. I would be back in politics, and I'd probably be in there for one term. Because, I would tell, the most controversial thing, I think the For instance, the slogan of defund the police was not a smart slogan. It was a great slogan on a bumper sticker. Most people don't understand it.
Mm-hmm.
It has a great sense behind it. Police are not doing their job. I'm not going to give money to someone that's going to be basically beating up innocent people. That is a better message than saying defund police. Just say what you don't give money to police who are beating up innocent people.
Mm-hmm.
Defund police, you allow the imagination of people to say, oh my God, that means there'll be speeders. Oh my God, that means that when I need help, it won't be there.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't create a full picture.
Mm-hmm.
You got to create a full picture for people so they understand what you want.
Okay, so who's making these decisions? I mean, obviously we're not talking about the sharpest knives in the drawer.
Yeah.
So are we talking, is it politics? Because you can get elected, but you're still responsible to the people that got you into office.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to hear you come out and say, "Hell, I'm just here for one term." So
Oh no,
all of your work
Yeah.
is, well, I know that we have a little bit of time left, and there's another line of questioning that I want to get into, and I think this is the best time to get into.
Okay.
So looking at, I think we have maybe 10 minutes or so. So looking around what's going on now. You started out in the 1960s.
Yeah.
And you're talking about your spaceship, and you're going to take your spaceship to this place.
Yeah.
Did your spaceship arrive? Are you where you wanted to be?
I would say I am where I wanted to be at certain times.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said earlier, but the times change.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not you have to get back in your spaceship, but you have to remain alive. Yeah, it's not like, I mean, some people don't, but I mean, it's not like, okay, I'm just going to go to the garden now and just, puddle around. I'm still active. I still, there are things that are worse now than there were before,
Mm-hmm.
I think, but there are many things that are better. But in some ways,
Name one.
that are better now?
Yeah.
Oh, we are, let's take a look at, for instance, the whole argument for paid sick leave, which I was very engaged in. It didn't exist before. It exists now, and it's growing now. Now look at things that are worse. Not paid sick leave, minimum wage. The minimum wage was higher back in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's worse now.
Mm-hmm.
But the issue of increasing the minimum wage is for the first time in 50 years coming back. People are realizing there has to be we have to increase it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's worse, but the energy going forward in increasing the minimum wage is the same kind of energy that we're putting into other sort of things to make them better.
Okay, but what is your motivation for increasing it?
Increasing the minimum wage?
Yeah.
To increase people's ability to live a life with some minimal level of security and enjoyment.
Doing jobs that are necessary and need to be done, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I see, I absolutely agree with you on that. And anyway, but I think that issue really kind of highlights what has happened. Because between the time you started doing this, okay, if we look across the way, we're in West Seattle, Amazon, Google, super multi-billionaires, right?
Yes.
And you're talking about paying their people just such as $15 an hour.
No, that's not.
I actually, I was, when I ran, I'm advocating $20 an hour because I want, and now we're going to see inflation so high we don't even know what's going to happen. But anyway, what has happened is that the corporations have control politics now. And now that the corporations are a person and they can, unlimited funding will go into them, the poor working guy that you're trying to protect, and I'm trying to protect. And, it's funny that we both have similar backgrounds, and I'm not Roman Catholic, but you ended up, I'm 10 years behind you. I'm the last of the boomers. And we ended up kind of on we see exactly the same things exactly the same way, but we're on opposite ends, at least of the political spectrum. But we see things exactly the same way. So what happened? And what happened was time, television, and maybe what we were brought up with, I guess.
Well, the point you're making is that, and what has happened, and what's obviously worse from the 60s, is the growth of corporate power and the immense gap that has resulted in wealth distribution. It's not just income, it's wealth, and the accumulation of wealth into fewer and fewer hands. It's not just, it is unsustainable for any economy. Even authoritarian economies can't survive on that, and particularly democracy cannot. So we are at a time right now where I think, the party that represents a smaller and smaller portion of the population are the Republicans. And they, I think, cannot continue to exist in a democracy. And that's why you find so many of them willing to follow into Trump's footsteps of going towards an autocracy of some sort. There are examples in Europe. You look at Poland, you look at Hungary, who on paper are democracies, to a certain extent, even having under Modi in India, where they start putting constraints on the media. They start trying to manipulate the judicial system to maintain a power base in their country. And that's going on right now. So that certainly is something that is worse. But I think we still have enough tools to work against and ultimately succeed in stopping that process from going forward. But it's going to get a lot more intense. And I'm not predicting that we're not going to have violence of some sort in the future. I would not recommend it. I'm opposed to it. But I'm not in control. And if there are more and more people who feel that they are locked out, and by the way, a lot of people on the right, the populist right, feel they're locked out. They are locked out of the economy. They just, I believe, have been told who's creating that problem, right? It's the Democrats who created that problem. And so there's anger there. And anger does arise from the right wing, and often it's not for democratic purposes, although they may believe it is. It will end up in a more authoritarian government. And that is right now the struggle, I think. I feel most impressed to try to halt and try to confront.
Well, okay, so isn't that like the beauty of democracy? Because, at one point, and the things that you say, being a conservative, I can say, well, what about Facebook? They, limit people's speech. I've had YouTube videos taken down that have to deal with the coronavirus. And you say anything about the coronavirus and it's taken down. So, and let's get into my cartoon. And I'm going to flash my cartoon now. So, in the cartoon, you have the 60s, and then you have the liberals of the 60s and the liberals now. And now it is completely conformist, do what the government tells you to do, don't ask any questions. The government's right about everything. I can't believe you'd even agree with that for a second.
No, and this is what's, it's really funny.
Liberals, do you think the government is right in all the stuff that they're doing, like with the vaccines and how they're treating China and...
Well, no. And I also think that all governments are wrong a large part of the time, and sometimes they get it right. It's not a black or white situation. I'm one of those people who, vaccinated and wear a mask and things of that sort. But I see people wearing a mask when they're out for a hike. You know, it's like, wait a second, that doesn't, there's no science anywhere that supports that. And this is the problem.
But you're this video now, because you said that,
Yeah.
YouTube will delete it because you said that. So now I'm going to have to
Okay.
alter. So it's gotten that bad. We don't even have free speech.
Yeah,
Where's the democracy?
yeah, no.
now?
Free speech is something that is often the first child to be strangled as an authoritarian father takes place, right? Takes control. It's really hard to have free speech when people are saying things that you think are dangerous to other people. But unless there's an immediate danger, then you have to bear with it. Now, but let's get back to this idea of liberal. Liberalism or liberals is probably the dirtiest word in the dictionary. I don't know anybody on the left or the right who likes liberals. I don't even know liberals who like liberals, because it's one of these, it's tantamount to basically saying that you're a leper. But one of the elements of liberals is that get along sort of mentality. Okay, we'll just get along. And that is a problem, because if you carry it too far, you end up giving up your rights because you're just getting along, or you're deferring to a simplistic definition of science, or a simplistic definition of what's the safety thing to do, okay? And that's what I think happens. We do not have leaders who question. You know, for instance, when someone says it's science, if you're familiar with science, science never has a single answer. They have multiple, like economists, you know, they have multiple answers, but they sort of deal on probability. The basis of science is probability, the probability of something happening. Okay, so that's the context you have to place it in. And I think what happens with leaders, again, they think, I have to be a leader and I have to show that, you know, I know what's going on and we're going to do it this way. That has a counterproductive effect. It alienates people, it makes people dig their heels in. I mean, I think the mask situation could have been worked differently. And I think even if Fauci had been given more legroom to maneuver, I mean, I think part of his was a reaction against Trump. It's sort of funny. There was an interview on NPR, someone saying, you know, the immigration policies between Trump and Obama, in some ways, in some measurements, are not that different. But Trump made it so personal, made it so egregious, made it so inhumane that you almost ignore the faults in the system that contribute to keeping people who should be admitted, and also faults of letting people in who shouldn't be admitted. You know, politics should not be consumed by marketing, and that is the basic problem. That's why, quite honestly, I wrote this book not as a rant and not as a rave. I wrote it as, this is what I think. This is what happened. What I saw happening as another, you know, a soldier. I wasn't, you know, a national leader at all. You know, I was maybe a leader on campus for a year. Okay, that was my sphere, right? But I saw the people what they were trying to do, and even now when I write the citizenship politics, the basic line is, what does it mean to be a citizen? It's not a piece of paper. It's how you behave in society. You can have a piece of paper and not act like a citizen, or you could not have that piece of paper and be more of a citizen than someone who does have one. And that's what this nation was built on. That's what makes, I mean, Americans say, well, America's caught up in uniqueness. There is a certain uniqueness. It's both good and bad, but there is a certain interesting, in some ways, America was founded, North America at least, in the U.S., as a refuge for people who were trying to escape from somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Now the Indians weren't, the Native Americans weren't, certainly, and that's another whole series of oppressions that we have to live up to.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, on the city council, I was a person in favor of, Columbus Day, we need to think about, Native American Day, or whatever we were talking about, as a better. And I'm Italian, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I had Italians coming to me,
Yeah.
because I was a member of the Italian club, and they were saying, hey, you know what? Well, I went to the meetings and celebrations, and they said, what are you doing? I said, look, Italians are very generous people. We share. We can share this day. It doesn't have to be about us. It can be about the people who are here. We can celebrate together, this founding of culture.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to...
You didn't say, forget about it.
Well, if I had, they probably would have laughed.
Go here. I told you earlier that there's a quote from Themistocles, and he's walking along the beach outside of Athens with his son. And now Themistocles was the one responsible for building the walls and the Battle of Thermopylae, and some of those hulks that he and his son are looking at on the beach may have been from that battle. And he says to his son, he says, look and take notice. This is what happens to leaders in a democracy. So are we looking at the rotting hulk of Nick Licata on the shore, or are you still keeping active, and what are you doing?
Well, we all rot at some point. I'm much more conscious of that as unfortunately my friends pass away. But no, I'm still active, but I'm not active because I have this guilt that I have to be active. To me, it's like, I think these sharks never stop swimming because they do, they'll drown. I hate to compare myself to a shark, but I still like, I keep moving because that's keeps the water, it keeps the air, it keeps the thoughts moving through my head. Right? Otherwise, we ossify, right? I mean,
yeah, but you have a lot of people wanting your knowledge, wanting your wisdom.
Yeah.
You're helping out. You're doing book reviews and all that. So how active? How much do we see of Nick Licata in Seattle Council's decisions and their programs now?
You mean?
Are you helping? Are you giving any input to the city council?
Oh,
are you the Svengali behind the scenes?
No, well, I'm not manipulating behind the scenes, and let's put it this way: I'm contacted a lot by people who have problems with government, often city council, and I work one-on-one with them, free. I decided not to become a consultant for two reasons. One, I don't make money at it, and two, I just feel like I don't want to make money at it. It just seems something not good about it.
Yeah.
But I work a lot with folks who have all kinds of problems you would never believe. And sometimes they're technical, sometimes they're grand. I meet with them. I do an outline of what you could do to get something done. I do talk to people on the council. Two of them are my former campaign managers, who are now council members. But when I was on the council, I got along with just about everybody, actually. Former council members I'm still in touch with, so we talk about what's going on in the city. But also, I'm very conscious of not wanting to play a role of, stop by the council. Well, we used to do it this way. You should do it that way, because I know it turned me off, and I think it would turn off anybody else. What's he doing here? So it's more like I'm working with people who want to work with me, who want some advice, and it may be good advice, bad advice. That's for them to decide. I'm not the kind of person that's going to give supposedly free, heavy-handed advice to people who are already in a position of power. I mean, I'll tell them what I think, what I'm hearing, and what I think they should do to help these folks out. But it's not me telling them what the right way to do something is. God, they don't listen anyhow.
Okay. So, but you're staying active, and do you I have to ask you this. Would you want to be mayor of Seattle as things are right now?
You know, after my first term in the city council, I was asked by some people who should run for mayor. And I'm thinking, well, I was just in the city council for 1 year, but for one term, but that hasn't stopped other people from running and sometimes winning. And some people who've never been on council and running for mayor. I think being mayor at any time is difficult. You're never really in control. You have more levers, but you're never totally in control. And it would be a real challenge. I think it would be. I mean, honestly, I would give it my best shot of trying to work around some of the major problems we have. I'll give you one quick example. Okay, if I was a candidate for mayor, I would do something that I don't think I've seen done, and this is from candidates that are talking about the homeless issue. There are other cities who have done things about homeless issues that seem to work. Not all of them, but you could pick and choose. If I was a candidate for mayor, one of the things I would do would be, I'd call in a panel from people around the country, from cities that had some success. And I would have that panel now in the middle of the race. Well, aren't you busy campaigning? The campaign is to educate the public. This would be an educational experience. You bring them in and have a discussion as opposed to, I'm going to build X number of houses. Well, maybe or maybe not. You don't know. How are you going to do it? Or I'm going to make sure the parks are clear. Well, how are you going to do that? When I was on the council, the one thing I did continue was always bring in people from the outside and listen to them and say, how are you working with it? It's a community effort. It's an organizational effort. The biggest problem politicians make, I think, is they rely too much on themselves and not on working with other people to come to a solution. So,
fantastic. All right. Well, Nick, I cannot tell you what an honor it's been to well, I have to, you're looking at history here. You're looking at Seattle history here. And I really feel honored to be here. So the book is Student Power, Democracy, and Revolution in the 60s. You can get it on the links on this video. And it's on Amazon, correct? Or
it's not expensive. You can go directly to the publisher. But I'm also saying, go to your public library. The public library's gotten, I think, 15 copies, and they'll get more if there's more demand. And I say, you don't have to spend money. That's why we have public libraries. Yeah. You can get a free book. If you want to keep it, great, buy it. But if you want to read it, go to the public library and call them. If you're not in Seattle, call the county library. If you're in another town, just say, look, I want to read this book. I want to save some money. Can you provide it? That's why we have democracy. We want to make sure that people have a chance to read.
That's fantastic. No capitalism here. Well, that's fantastic. Actually, but I'm going to tell you, support Nick, buy the book, and you can get it on my website. You can get it on Amazon, and you can get it in the links in the description. But
let me add one more thing.
Yes.
I have a website, actually. It's www.becomingacitizenactivist. And at that website, you can also sign up for my newsletter, which is free. And doesn't bombard you. They only come out probably twice a month. And they tend to be more analytical pieces. But if you're into that kind of thing, go there.
Okay. I think the first time I interviewed you, I asked you if your book was the Anarchist Cookbook. Or was this like the Anarchist Cookbook? So, well, Nick, you really set people on fire, and you are just a treasure, and it's an honor to even be able to interview you. So thank you so much.
Thank you for coming over.
And
appreciate it.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. So I'm with Nick Licata. We're on West Seattle, and this is Books in Heinessight. So remember what we always say: keep on reading.
This has been Books in Heinessight with your host, Matthew Heines. Please join us for our next podcast and look for our archives on iTunes and go to theheinessight.com. That's Heines site.com for great books by Matthew Heines and other great authors.